The rain pounded against the windows of the downtown coffee shop as Sarah Mitchell sat in the corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. She wore a simple navy blue hoodie and jeans, nothing that would draw attention. That was exactly how she preferred it these days. After everything that had happened, staying invisible felt safer. Sarah had been living quietly in Portland for the past 3 years, working as a night shift security guard at a local warehouse. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and let her keep to herself. Most people assumed she was just another veteran trying to find her place in civilian life. They weren't entirely wrong, though they had no idea about the real story. The coffee shop door chimed as a group of college students entered, laughing and shaking rain from their jackets. Sarah glanced up briefly, then returned her attention to the newspaper spread across the table. Old habits died hard. Even in a peaceful setting like this, she automatically cataloged exits, noted potential threats, and kept her back to the wall. "Excuse me, miss?" Sarah looked up to see a young man, probably early 20s, standing beside her table. He had the eager look of someone about to ask for directions or spare change. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo," he said, pointing to her forearm where a small anchor design was visible below her rolled-up sleeve. "My uncle was in the Navy. Were you stationed somewhere cool?" Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was exactly the kind of conversation she tried to avoid. "Just did my time and got out," she replied simply, hoping he would take the hint. But the young man persisted. "That's so cool, though. I've been thinking about enlisting. Maybe special forces or something. Did you ever work with any SEALs? I heard they train at some crazy facilities." The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She could feel her pulse quicken, and for a moment, she was transported back to those grueling months of training, the salt water in her lungs, the endless physical demands, the brotherhood that had meant everything to her. "No," she said quietly. "I wasn't involved with anything like that." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Sarah had learned that sometimes the truth was too complicated, too dangerous, and too painful to share with strangers. The young man finally picked up on her reluctance and moved on. But the damage was done. Sarah's carefully maintained peace had been shattered by a simple question. She finished her coffee quickly and headed out into the rain. 3 blocks from the coffee shop, Sarah noticed the black sedan. It was following at a distance, maintaining just enough space to seem coincidental. But Sarah had been trained to spot surveillance, and this was textbook. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had someone finally tracked her down? After all this time, had her past caught up with her? She took a series of seemingly random turns, doubling back through side streets and cutting through a small park. The sedan stayed with her, confirming her suspicions. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She needed to lose the tail and find out who was following her. Using a busy intersection to her advantage, Sarah slipped into a crowded shopping mall and made her way to the upper level. From a window overlooking the parking lot, she watched as 2 men in dark suits got out of the sedan and split up to search for her. They moved with military precision, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Hello, Sarah. We need to talk." The voice was calm, professional, and unfamiliar. Sarah ended the call immediately and removed the battery from her phone. Whatever this was about, it wasn't good. For the next hour, Sarah used every evasion technique she had ever learned. She changed clothes in a department store bathroom, altered her appearance with a baseball cap and glasses from a gift shop, and exited through a service entrance. But somehow, they always seemed to be one step behind her. Finally, exhausted and running out of options, Sarah found herself cornered in an alley behind a restaurant. The 2 men appeared at both ends of the alley, blocking her escape routes. They weren't pointing weapons, but their stance suggested they were ready for anything. "Sarah Mitchell," the taller man called out. "We're with the FBI. We need you to come with us." Sarah raised her hand slowly. "What's this about?" "You're under arrest for violation of the Stolen Valor Act," the agent replied as he approached with handcuffs. "Specifically, for falsely claiming to be a Navy SEAL." Sarah's blood ran cold. "I never claimed to be a SEAL," she protested. "We have multiple witnesses who say otherwise," the second agent said. "Bar patrons, former colleagues, social media posts. You've been telling people you were a Navy SEAL for over 2 years." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Sarah's mind reeled. Someone had been spreading lies about her, creating a false identity that she had never claimed. But who would do such a thing? And why? The agents led her to their vehicle, and as they drove through the city streets, Sarah stared out the window at the life she had built slowly falling away. The warehouse job, the quiet apartment, the carefully constructed anonymity, all of it was crumbling because of accusations she didn't understand. At the federal building, Sarah was processed like any other criminal. Fingerprints, photos, paperwork. The agents were professional but cold, treating her as just another case of stolen valor, a growing problem that diminished the sacrifices of real military heroes. "Look," Sarah said during the initial interview, "I think there's been a mistake. I never told anyone I was a SEAL. I was in the Navy, yes, but I never claimed any special operations training." Agent Rodriguez, the lead investigator, slid a folder across the table. "These are statements from 17 different people who say you explicitly told them you were a Navy SEAL. Bar conversations, workplace discussions, even a dating profile." Sarah opened the folder and felt her world tilt. The statements were detailed and consistent. They described conversations she had never had, boasts she had never made, stories she had never told. Someone had been living a lie in her name, but she had no idea who or why. "I don't understand this," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of this happened." Agent Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Mitchell, we take stolen valor very seriously. Military service members risk their lives for their country, and when civilians pretend to share those honors, it's not just illegal. It's deeply offensive to everyone who actually served." "I did serve," Sarah insisted. "I was in the Navy for 6 years. I have an honorable discharge, but I was never a SEAL, and I never told anyone I was." The agent consulted his notes. "According to our investigation, you've been using your supposed SEAL background to gain respect, get drinks bought for you, even secure employment. That's fraud, plain and simple." Sarah felt trapped in a nightmare. Everything the agent described sounded plausible on the surface, but none of it was true. Someone had created an elaborate deception using her identity, and now she was facing the consequences. The holding cell was small and cold, with concrete walls and a narrow bench. Sarah sat in the corner trying to make sense of what was happening. Who could have known enough about her to create such a detailed false identity? And why would they do it? Her thoughts were interrupted when a guard appeared at the cell door. "Mitchell, you have a visitor." Sarah followed the guard down a corridor to a small meeting room. Sitting at the metal table was a woman in her 50s, wearing a sharp business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She had the look of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jennifer Walsh, your court-appointed attorney," the woman said as Sarah sat down across from her. "We need to talk about your case." Sarah felt a spark of hope. Finally, someone who might listen to her side of the story. "Ms. Walsh, I need you to understand something," Sarah began. "I never claimed to be a Navy SEAL. Someone has been using my identity to tell these stories, but it wasn't me." The attorney opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Sarah, I've reviewed the evidence against you, and I have to be honest. It's substantial. Multiple witnesses, documented statements, even photographs of you wearing military insignia that doesn't match your actual service record." Sarah's heart sank. "Photographs? What photographs?" Ms. Walsh slid several printed photos across the table. Sarah stared at them in disbelief. They showed a woman who looked exactly like her, wearing Navy SEAL insignia and posing with groups of people in various bars and social settings. But Sarah had never seen these places or people before in her life. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered. "These aren't me. I mean, they look like me, but I've never been to any of these places." The attorney studied Sarah's face carefully. "You're saying these are fake? Digitally altered?" "They have to be," Sarah replied. "But who would go to such elaborate lengths to frame me for something like this?" Ms. Walsh closed the file and leaned forward. "Sarah, stolen valor cases are usually pretty straightforward. Someone lies about their military service, gets caught, and faces the consequences. But your case is different. The level of detail, the consistency of the false claims, the photographic evidence, someone put a lot of effort into this deception." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. At least her attorney seemed willing to consider that something unusual was happening. "We need to start from the beginning," Ms. Walsh continued. "Tell me about your actual military service, your life after discharge, and anyone who might have a reason to do this to you." As Sarah began to recount her story, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple case of stolen valor. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to destroy her life, and she had no idea who or why. The rain continued to fall outside the federal building, washing away any traces of the quiet life Sarah had worked so hard to build. Tomorrow, she would face a judge and try to prove her innocence in a case where all the evidence pointed to her guilt. But tonight, in the cold confines of the holding cell, she could only wonder who had turned her life into a lie and what they hoped to gain by destroying her. The next morning brought no relief from the storm clouds gathering over Sarah's life. She sat in the defendant's chair, watching as people filed into the federal courtroom. Judge Harrison was known for being tough on military fraud cases, and the prosecutor looked confident as he arranged his papers. Sarah's attorney had spent the night reviewing the case files, and her expression was grim. The evidence against Sarah was overwhelming, and proving it was fabricated would be nearly impossible without knowing who was behind the elaborate deception. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Harrison entered the courtroom. The preliminary hearing proceeded quickly. The prosecutor outlined the charges against Sarah, describing her as a civilian who had repeatedly claimed Navy SEAL training and service to gain personal advantages. He presented witness statements, photographs, and even social media posts that appeared to show Sarah making these false claims. When it was time for Sarah's plea, she stood slowly. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Harrison studied her for a moment. "Ms. Mitchell, the evidence against you appears substantial. Are you certain you understand the charges and the potential consequences?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "I understand the charges, but I maintain my innocence." "I never made these claims." The judge set a trial date for 6 weeks away and granted bail, though the amount was substantial enough that Sarah knew she couldn't afford it. As the court session ended, she realized she would be staying in custody until trial. Back in the holding area, Sarah was allowed a phone call. She had no family to contact, few friends, and no money for a private attorney. She was about to hang up when she remembered Dr. Elizabeth Grant, a psychiatrist she had worked with during her transition out of the military. Dr. Grant had been kind and professional, and Sarah hoped she might remember her enough to offer some help. "Dr. Grant's office," a familiar voice answered. "This is Sarah Mitchell. I worked with Dr. Grant a few years ago. I'm in some serious trouble and wondered if she might be willing to help." There was a pause. "Sarah? Hold on. Let me get the doctor." A minute later, Dr. Grant's warm voice came on the line. "Sarah, it's good to hear from you. What's happening?" Sarah quickly explained her situation, and Dr. Grant listened without interruption. "Sarah, This sounds incredibly serious. I remember our sessions and you were always very honest about your service record. You specifically mentioned that you weren't special forces and felt somewhat inadequate compared to some of the other veterans in group therapy. This accusation doesn't match the person I knew at all. Those words gave Sarah the first real hope she had felt in days. Would you be willing to testify about that? Absolutely, Dr. Grant replied. But Sarah, I think there might be more to this than just character testimony. The level of fabrication you're describing suggests someone with significant resources and expertise. Have you considered who might want to destroy your credibility this thoroughly? Sarah had been asking herself that same question. I can't think of anyone. I've kept a low profile, stayed out of trouble. I don't understand why anyone would target me. After the call ended, Sarah was transported to the county jail to await trial. The general population was rough, filled with people facing everything from drug charges to violent crimes. Sarah kept to herself, using the survival skills she had learned in the military to navigate the dangerous environment. 3 days into her incarceration, Sarah was approached by another inmate during lunch. Maria Santos was serving time for embezzlement, but she had been a paralegal before her arrest and knew how to research legal cases. I heard about your situation, Maria said quietly. Stolen valor, right? That's heavy stuff. Sarah nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. Look, I've been thinking about your case. Someone went to a lot of trouble to frame you. The photographs, the consistent witness statements, the social media presence. That's not amateur hour. That's professional-level deception. Sarah looked at Maria with new interest. What are you suggesting? I'm saying maybe you should start thinking about who has the resources and motivation to pull off something like this, and more importantly, what they might gain from discrediting you specifically. That night, lying on her narrow bunk, Sarah forced herself to think back through her military service. She had served on 3 different ships during her 6 years in the Navy, working in communications and intelligence support. Most of her work had been routine, but there had been one assignment that stood out. During her final year of service, Sarah had been temporarily assigned to a joint task force operation in the Mediterranean. The mission was classified, involving surveillance of suspected arms trafficking routes. Sarah's job had been to monitor and decode communications intercepts, but she had noticed some irregularities in the data that didn't make sense. When she reported her concerns to her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, she had been told to focus on her assigned duties and not worry about the bigger picture. But Sarah's training had taught her to pay attention to details, and the patterns she saw in the communications suggested that someone with access to their intelligence was feeding information to the traffickers. Sarah had documented her findings and prepared a report, but before she could submit it through proper channels, her assignment ended abruptly. She was transferred back to her original unit and never heard anything more about the investigation. A few months later, she left the Navy and tried to put the whole experience behind her. Now, sitting in a jail cell facing stolen valor charges, Sarah wondered if her discovery on that long-ago assignment might be connected to her current predicament. If someone had been running a profitable arms trafficking operation and Sarah had stumbled onto evidence of it, they would have strong motivation to discredit her before she could cause problems. The more Sarah thought about it, the more sense it made. Lieutenant Commander Webb had been in the perfect position to interfere with intelligence gathering. If he was involved with the traffickers, her report would have been a serious threat to his operation. By framing her for stolen valor, he could ensure that anything she might say about the arms trafficking would be dismissed as the lies of a discredited fraud. Sarah spent the next several days trying to remember every detail she could about the Mediterranean assignment. She recalled names, dates, and specific communications intercepts. Most importantly, she remembered that she had kept copies of some of her documentation, hidden away in a storage unit she rented before leaving the Navy. When her attorney visited again, Sarah shared her theory about the connection to her old assignment. Sarah, that's a serious accusation, Ms. Walsh said carefully. Are you saying you think a Navy officer framed you for stolen valor to cover up arms trafficking? I know how it sounds, Sarah replied, but it's the only thing that makes sense. The level of sophistication in this frame-up, the resources required, the military knowledge needed to make it believable. It points to someone with inside access. Ms. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. If you're right, we're not just dealing with a stolen valor case anymore. We're talking about conspiracy, obstruction of justice, possibly treason. Do you have any proof of these trafficking allegations? Sarah told her about the storage unit and the documents she had kept. I wasn't sure why I saved them at the time. Maybe some instinct told me they might be important someday. We need to get those documents, Ms. Walsh said. If they support your theory, we have to take this to the FBI. But Sarah, you need to understand the risks. If you're right about this conspiracy, then the people behind it have already demonstrated they're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. The next day, Ms. Walsh obtained a court order allowing them to access Sarah's storage unit. What they found there would change everything. Hidden in a box behind her old Navy uniforms were dozens of pages of communications intercepts, decoded messages, and Sarah's own analysis showing clear evidence of information leaks to arms traffickers. But more importantly, they found a letter that Sarah had written to herself but never sent. In it, she detailed her suspicions about Lieutenant Commander Webb and her fear that reporting the trafficking evidence might put her in danger. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before her assignment ended, proving that Sarah had identified the problem years before she was charged with stolen valor. Ms. Walsh immediately contacted the FBI to report the new evidence. Agent Rodriguez, the same man who had arrested Sarah, agreed to meet with them. This is a serious development, Rodriguez said after reviewing the documents. If these communications intercepts are genuine, and if they show evidence of arms trafficking, then we need to investigate further. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and terror. Does this mean you believe me about the stolen valor charges? Rodriguez was careful in his response. It means we're going to look into the possibility that your current charges are connected to a larger conspiracy. But Sarah, you need to understand that if this is real, you're in significant danger. The people behind arms trafficking operations don't hesitate to eliminate threats. That night, Sarah was moved to protective custody within the jail. The isolation was difficult, but she felt safer knowing that her attorney and the FBI were finally taking her seriously. 2 days later, Agent Rodriguez returned with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb had been found dead in his home, apparently the victim of a burglary gone wrong. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. We're treating his death as suspicious, Rodriguez told Sarah, and we're expediting our investigation into the trafficking allegations. But Sarah, this means that whoever is behind this conspiracy knows we're getting close to the truth. As Sarah processed this information, she realized that her fight for freedom had become something much more dangerous. She wasn't just trying to clear her name anymore. She was potentially the key witness in a case involving arms trafficking, military corruption, and now murder. The evidence was mounting that Sarah had been framed not just for stolen valor, but as part of a cover-up that reached deep into military intelligence operations. Someone had spent considerable time and resources creating a false identity for her, destroying her credibility before she could expose their crimes. But with Webb's death, Sarah knew that the people behind this conspiracy were getting desperate. They had already shown they were willing to kill to protect their secrets, and she was the one person who could still bring them down. The trial was only 3 weeks away, but Sarah realized that the courtroom might not be where her fate would ultimately be decided. The real battle was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. The federal courthouse was buzzing with unusual activity as Sarah's trial date arrived. What had begun as a straightforward stolen valor case had evolved into something much more complex, involving military intelligence, arms trafficking, and murder. Media trucks lined the street outside, drawn by rumors of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of naval operations. Sarah sat at the defense table wearing the only professional outfit her attorney had been able to find for her. 3 weeks in protective custody had taken their toll, but her mind was sharp and focused. She knew that the next few hours would determine not just her freedom, but possibly her life. The prosecution team looked uncomfortable. What should have been an easy conviction had become a minefield of classified information and federal investigations. Agent Rodriguez sat in the gallery, along with several other FBI agents Sarah didn't recognize. As jury selection concluded, Judge Harrison addressed the crowded courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case has attracted significant attention due to certain developments that have come to light during the investigation. I want to make it clear that we are here today to determine the guilt or innocence of the defendant on the specific charges of stolen valor, not to relitigate larger questions of military policy or intelligence operations." The prosecutor's opening statement was brief and uncertain. He outlined the original charges against Sarah, but seemed hesitant to emphasize evidence that might be connected to the broader conspiracy investigation. The witness statements and photographs were presented, but without the confident assertion that they proved Sarah's guilt. When Ms. Walsh stood to give the defense opening statement, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "3 weeks ago, my client Sarah Mitchell appeared to be guilty of a crime that strikes at the heart of military honor. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming, but as we investigated further, we discovered something that shocked even experienced federal investigators. Sarah Mitchell didn't just fail to commit the crime she's accused of. She was deliberately and systematically framed as part of a conspiracy to cover up arms trafficking and military corruption." The prosecutor objected, but Judge Harrison allowed the statement to stand, noting that the defense had a right to present their theory of the case. Ms. Walsh continued, "You will hear evidence that Ms. Mitchell stumbled upon a military intelligence operation that was feeding information to arms traffickers. When she attempted to report this discovery, her assignment was terminated, and her superiors took steps to discredit her. The stolen valor accusations you will hear about were not the result of Ms. Mitchell's lies, but rather the product of an elaborate deception designed to destroy her credibility before she could expose the truth." The first witness called by the prosecution was Derek Morrison, a bartender who claimed Sarah had told him multiple times that she was a Navy SEAL. Morrison seemed nervous as he took the oath, and his testimony was hesitant and inconsistent. During cross-examination, Ms. Walsh revealed that Morrison had significant gambling debts and had received a payment of $5,000 just 2 weeks before Sarah's arrest. When pressed about who had paid him, Morrison claimed he couldn't remember, but his discomfort was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. The pattern continued with the next several witnesses. Each claimed to have heard Sarah boast about SEAL training, but under cross-examination, each revealed financial troubles or recent unexplained payments. By the end of the first day of testimony, it was clear that someone had paid these people to lie about Sarah. Dr. Elizabeth Grant took the stand on the second day of trial. Her testimony was compelling and detailed, describing her sessions with Sarah and specifically noting that Sarah had expressed feelings of inadequacy compared to Special Forces veterans. Ms. Mitchell was very clear about her actual service record, Dr. Grant testified. She served honorably in communications and intelligence support, but she never claimed any special operations training. In fact, she seemed almost embarrassed that her service wasn't more dramatic or heroic. The prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Grant was brief and ineffective. Her credentials and credibility were impeccable, and her detailed notes from their sessions provided a clear picture of Sarah's actual attitude toward her military service. But the real surprise came when Agent Rodriguez took the stand as a defense witness. His testimony revealed the scope of the investigation that had developed around Sarah's case. "As we investigated the stolen valor charges," Rodriguez explained, We discovered evidence suggesting that Ms. Mitchell had been the target of an elaborate frame-up. The sophistication of the deception, the resources required, and the military knowledge necessary to make it believable all pointed to professional involvement. Rodriguez described the arms trafficking investigation, the suspicious death of Lieutenant Commander Webb, and the documentary evidence found in Sarah's storage unit. As he spoke, several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah noticed a man in a Navy uniform who seemed particularly interested in the testimony. During a brief recess, Sarah pointed out the naval officer to her attorney. "I don't recognize him, but something about him makes me nervous." Ms. Walsh discreetly asked Agent Rodriguez about the man, and within minutes the courtroom was in chaos. The naval officer had attempted to leave the building but was stopped by FBI agents in the lobby. When they searched his briefcase, they found documents related to the arms trafficking investigation and a detailed file on Sarah's background. Judge Harrison called an emergency session to address this development. "It appears that this trial has taken another unexpected turn," he announced. "I'm declaring a recess while federal authorities investigate this matter further." The naval officer, identified as Commander James Fletcher, was arrested and charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Under interrogation, he revealed details of a military intelligence operation that had been selling information to arms dealers for over 5 years. Lieutenant Commander Webb had been the operational leader, but Fletcher had been responsible for security and counterintelligence. When Sarah discovered evidence of their activities, Fletcher had been tasked with discrediting her before she could cause problems. The stolen valor frame-up had been Fletcher's idea. By creating false evidence of Sarah making SEAL claims, they could ensure that any allegations she made about arms trafficking would be dismissed as the lies of a discredited fraud. The plan had worked perfectly until Sarah's attorney discovered the documentary evidence in her storage unit. When Webb realized that the FBI was investigating the trafficking allegations, he had panicked and threatened to confess everything. Fletcher admitted to arranging Webb's death, making it look like a burglary to protect the conspiracy. With Fletcher's confession, the case against Sarah collapsed completely. The prosecution moved to dismiss all charges, and Judge Harrison granted the motion with obvious relief. But as Sarah stood to leave the courtroom a free woman, Agent Rodriguez approached her with a serious expression. "Sarah, I need you to understand that this isn't over," he said quietly. "Fletcher was just one part of the operation. There are others involved, and some of them are still out there. You're going to need protection until we can round up the rest of the conspirators." Sarah felt a chill despite her relief at being cleared of the charges. "How many others are there?" "We're not sure yet," Rodriguez admitted. "But Fletcher's files suggest that this trafficking operation reached into multiple branches of the military and possibly some civilian contractors as well. You're the key witness now, and that makes you a target." Over the next several weeks, Sarah found herself in witness protection as the FBI worked to dismantle the trafficking network. The investigation revealed a sophisticated operation that had been selling military intelligence to arms dealers around the world, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. Sarah's original discovery in the Mediterranean had been just the tip of the iceberg. The communications intercepts she had preserved contained evidence of dozens of illegal transactions and compromised operations. Her willingness to speak up, even when it put her in danger, had exposed a conspiracy that threatened national security. The final confrontation came when Sarah was asked to testify before a grand jury investigating the highest levels of the conspiracy. As she entered the federal building for her testimony, she was surprised to see a familiar face in the hallway. General Patricia Morrison stood near the elevator, wearing full dress uniform with the stars of a 2-star general on her shoulders. Sarah had never met the general, but she had heard about her reputation as a tough, no-nonsense leader who demanded the highest standards from her personnel. As Sarah approached, General Morrison stepped forward and extended her hand. Miss Mitchell, I'm General Morrison. I wanted to thank you personally for your courage in exposing this conspiracy. Sarah shook the general's hand, feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the attention from such a high-ranking officer. Ma'am, I was just doing what I thought was right, Sarah replied. General Morrison smiled and rolled up her sleeve slightly, revealing a small tattoo on her forearm. It was a simple design, but Sarah recognized it immediately. It was the mark of a classified special operations unit, one so secret that very few people even knew it existed. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what she was seeing. General Morrison had served in the same unit that Sarah had been recruited for years ago, before a training accident had ended her chances of joining the elite group. You were selected for our program before your injury, General Morrison said quietly. Your commanding officers recommended you based on your analytical skills and integrity. When this conspiracy came to light, I remembered your name from the old files. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and sadness. The special operations training she had dreamed of had been cut short by a parachuting accident that left her with a permanent back injury. She had always wondered what might have been if she had been able to complete the program. Ma'am, I appreciate you telling me this, but I'm not sure why it matters now, Sarah said. General Morrison's expression grew serious. It matters because the people behind this trafficking operation specifically targeted you, not just because of what you discovered, but because of who you are. They knew about your background, your selection for our program, your potential to cause them real damage if you ever decided to investigate their activities. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the full scope of what had happened to her. The stolen valor frame-up hadn't been a desperate improvisation. It had been a calculated attack designed to neutralize a specific threat to their operation. The injury that ended your special operations training wasn't an accident, General Morrison continued. We've discovered evidence that your parachute was sabotaged. Someone wanted to make sure you never completed that program. As the truth sank in, Sarah realized that she had been fighting this battle for much longer than she had known. The conspiracy against her had begun years ago, when powerful people had recognized her potential and decided she was too dangerous to be allowed to reach her full capabilities. But in the end, their efforts to stop her had only delayed the inevitable. Sarah's determination to seek the truth and her refusal to give up in the face of overwhelming odds had exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military leadership. As she walked into the grand jury room to give her testimony, Sarah carried with her not just the evidence that would bring down the conspirators, but the knowledge that she had finally fulfilled the promise she had shown all those years ago when she was first selected for special operations training. The mark on General Morrison's arm had been a symbol of recognition, an acknowledgement that despite everything that had been done to stop her, Sarah Mitchell had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person the special operations community valued most, someone with the courage to do what was right, no matter the personal cost. The stolen valor charges that had nearly destroyed her life had ultimately led to the exposure of a conspiracy that threatened national security. In trying to silence her, her enemies had only ensured that her voice would be heard at the highest levels of government and military leadership. Justice had been a long time coming, but it had finally arrived.